Section 16 of 4 Science Fiction Novellas. 4 Science Fiction Novellas by Harl Vincent. Vulcan's Workshop, Part 2. Gannett transferred Luke to the dreaded sealed cell in the reduction plant, a room spoken of in hushed whispers by the convicts, and in which was reported an inmate suffered indescribable tortures for the better part of 3 weeks. Then he died in horrible misery, for one could not survive longer than that. Coolan had not been killed. He would recover, but was pretty well smashed up with a fractured hip and several broken ribs, one of which had punctured a lung. It would be necessary to return him to Mars on the next ether ship, due in 2 days. Strangely, the news brought Luke no great amount of satisfaction. When they locked him up in the sealed cell for his first period of labor he saw there was only one other occupant, a tall lanky earthman with narrow aristocratic features and keen gray eyes. He was perhaps 45, slightly stooped, and with thin graying hair. Luke had seen him several times at mess, and had contemptuously classed him as a highbrow. Fuller his name was. This was a small room where several slender chutes brought down tumbling crystals of silvery salt from somewhere above, emptying it into glass containers that stood in endless rows on wooden racks. You filled these containers with the salt, then sealed them in lead tubes and packed them for shipment. There was a faint pungent odor in the air of the room, a new smell that widened Luke's nostrils and caught at his throat and lungs. In this place you were watched by a guard who came regularly each half hour and spied on you through a peephole. Child's play, the work in the sealed cell. Luke went at it half-heartedly and spoke no word to Fuller after the heavy door had closed them in. After 10 minutes of silence he caught himself watching his companion furtively. What was there about Fuller that marked him as superior to Luke and the rest of the convicts? A good gust of wind would blow the man away. A woman might easily beat him in a rough and tumble. Yet this man had something which unmistakably proclaimed greatness, the same thing that gave authority and power to the smart guys of Earth and Mars. Brains, book learning, Luke snorted. Fuller was looking at him with calmly appraising gaze. Luke scowled darkly, but the keen eyes that measured him did not waver. "You're a fool, Fenton," came from the thin lips. "What?" Luke advanced threateningly. "I repeat, you are a fool." Still the gray eyes were unwavering. "Why, you—" Spasmodically Luke's fingers closed down on the spare shoulder with crushing force. By not so much as a flicker in an eyelash did Fuller betray the pain that must have come with that grip. He did not even wince, but swiftly lashed out with a bony fist, raking Luke's cheek with hard knuckles. The blow stung, but it was utterly futile. With a single cuff Luke could send the man sprawling, with a single wrench of his powerful hands snap his spine. Yet he did neither, and the impulse to laugh coarsely died in his throat. Here was the courage of a kind he had never encountered. Here a man whose bright eyes, fearlessness, and defiance mingled with a cool disdain that brought the first real feeling of inferiority Luke ever had experienced. He relaxed his grip on Fuller's shoulder and his big hands fell loosely at his sides. It was that action which saved Fenton. He did not know at the time, nor would he have believed it. But he was to remember many times and finally to realize it, though he never fully understood. "That's better," breathed Fuller, and the ghost of a smile crinkled the corner of his mouth. At the old man's warning Luke returned to his own workbench and was industriously engaged when the guard's eye showed at the peephole. Then the eye was gone and he grinned over at Fuller. "How long have you been in here?" he ventured. "5 days in the sealed cell, 10 altogether in the workshop." Luke pondered this. "How'd you get in the cell?" "Same way you did. I struck a guard." "No," marveled Luke. "Mean to tell me you—" "I had good reason to get in here," Fuller broke in mildly. You wanted to get in?" Luke was incredulous. "I did." My God, you ain't crazy. Wanted to get yourself killed off quicker? No, that isn't it, Fuller explained patiently. I've a plan to escape, and only by taking the chance of spending some time here could I obtain access to the necessary materials. Fenton, I'm a scientist, and I know— Escape? Luke snorted. You are crazy. Where you gonna go? Listen, Fenton. The other dropped his voice. I'm not doing this blindly. I have friends outside, and you can help me. You can get away yourself alive. I called you a fool, and by that I meant that you have relied too much on brute force in your lifetime and not had sense enough to realize that this brought only trouble. Combine your brawn with my brains now, and do as I say. If you will, I promise you freedom. Will you do it, or do you want to keep on being a fool? Luke bristled, but the earnestness of that steady gaze served to check his rising temper. I still think you're nuts, he growled. But hell, I ain't fool enough to pass up any kind of chance of getting out of here. Give me the dope. Fuller coughed slightly, and a fleck of red-tinged foam appeared at his lips. It'll have to be today, he whispered. One more day in this place, and it will be too late for me. XC! Luke stared, horrified. Fuller had it already and didn't know it. Poor devil, he was a goner before he started this crazy break of his. Strangely, Luke was deeply concerned. It was a new experience, this feeling of compassion for a fellow man. Today, he grunted. You ain't figuring on getting out today? Positively, it must be today. I'll explain. Much of what followed was unintelligible to Luke Fenton, but he absorbed enough of the scientist's explanation to understand that his plan was not impossible of realization. He waxed enthusiastic. Tom Fuller was vague concerning his own past, but Luke gathered that a political crime had been responsible for his sentence to the workshop. There was much bitterness in the scientist's refusal to dwell on this point. This, too, Luke was able to understand. The bond between them strengthened. It's like this, Fuller told him. These suits which enable us to move about comfortably in Vulcan's gravity are really quite simple in their functioning. A maze of fine wires is woven into the fabric, and these wires are charged with anti-gravity energies from tiny capsules which are inserted under the belt of the garment. The capsules are really miniature atomic generators and are replaced with fresh ones each night during the sleeping period, since the initial charge lasts only 18 hours. The generated energies neutralize more than 80% of the effect of gravity, and our weight thus becomes approximately the same as it is on Earth. Such garments are worn by all the prospectors and other visitors to Vulcan. How come the neutral beams? Asked Luke. They are used only here in the workshop, and they operate the same as the neutral broadcast from the bastion, the only difference being that the broadcast blankets an area of about 2 miles in all directions. In both cases, vibratory ether waves are sent out, and these are of such frequency and waveform as to neutralize the anti-gravity engines originating in our capsules. They render our suits useless, but those of the guards are provided with insulated coverings which block off the waves and thus permit their own garments to function even when the neutral broadcast is in operation. Smart guys, commented Luke. Too smart. How the devil we going to get away then? They'll send out the alarm and— Ah, that is where we fool them, Fenton. With the radium. Radium? Yes, didn't you know? This ore we mine here contains a higher percentage of that valuable element than any on Earth or Mars. Its emanations, together with certain atmospheric gases of Vulcan, are what cause XC, a swift destruction of tissue in the lungs and other vital organs. And this concentrate, Fuller waved his hand toward the rows of tubes before him, is most highly radioactive of all the products of the workshop. That is why the sealed cell is so very dangerous to work in, but it is this radioactive salt that gives us the means for escape. Both men turned quickly to their labors on hearing the footsteps of the guard. "My suit is already prepared," continued Fuller, when the eye had gone from the peephole. "Now to prepare yours. I discovered that this radioactivity can be used to defeat the purpose of the neutral waves as well or better than the regular insulation, which, of course, we cannot obtain. That is why I wanted to be in the sealed cell for a time. We merely pack a quantity of the radioactive salt around the capsules in the lining of our garments, and the radium emanations continue the excitation of the tiny atomic generators even under the influence of the neutralizing vibrations. Do you follow me?" Yes, Luke did comprehend, even though the technical explanation was beyond his understanding. They would be able to defy this terrible gravity of Vulcan. They could fight unhampered, walk or run, to meet these mysterious friends of Fuller's. The flashlights in the broadcast would be useless against them. The lanky scientist outlined the further details of his plan in swift whispers while he worked with the energizing capsule of Luke's garment. Actual escape was surprisingly easy. They waited until the labor period was finished, when Chanday, the yellow-skinned guard, came to unlock the door. As agreed, Tom Fuller came out first and Luke held back, dragging his feet and cursing softly to himself. "What'd you say?" snarled the guard. Luke grinned disarmingly. "Nothin'," he drawled. Still he hung back, scarcely moving from where he stood just within the door. "Come on, tough guy, a little speed." Chanday reached for him. And then Luke was upon him. The neutral beam flashed harmlessly. Luke's big hands moved with lightning swiftness, his left one scooping the guard's dart gun from his shoulder strap and his right closing on the astonished Oriental's windpipe. It was the work of only an instant to choke him in unconsciousness and lock him in the sealed cell. "Quick, the chute!" hissed Fuller. He dived head foremost into a rectangular wooden trough that was used for the disposal of the gang from a crushing mill above. This chute, Fuller had said, led to the outside at the back of the reduction plant. Across the passage Luke saw a squad of convicts and 2 guards emerging from the lift. Then he plunged down the steeply inclined trough after Fuller. As he slid and tumbled into the darkness, he heard the hoarse shouting of the guards. He landed heavily in the pile of gang at the base of the chute, then was scrambling and slipping down with an avalanche of the sharp-edged stone. At the bottom, he saw that Fuller had already started up the slope of the great pit which enclosed the workshop. Luke darted after him. They were hidden from the bastion by the buildings of the smelter and reduction plant. But the loud yelling of the guards back there in the pit gave evidence that word of the escape was being passed along to Gannett. Before they were halfway up the slope there was the shriek of the alarm siren, and Luke felt his body sag with a sudden increase of weight. Fool that he had been to trust the scrawny scientist! "It's the broadcast," panted Fuller beside him. "There is some effect, of course. You're probably carrying 50 extra pounds." "Huh?" Luke hoped it would be no worse. Fuller slipped into a narrow crevice that ran slantwise of the slope and extended upward to the rim of the pit. The going was much easier here, and they made rapid progress toward the top. Suddenly Luke realized that it was growing very cold. There was a bite to the foul air, and moisture from the red mist was frosting his beard. The liberation of the tiny planet and consequent shifting of the Terminator was bringing frigidity to Vulcan's workshop. They came up out of the crevice at the top of the pit, and Luke could not resist looking back. Every convict in sight was flattened to the ground. They sprawled singly and in heaps, each one a squashed inert thing that would not move again until the neutral broadcast was discontinued. The guards, confident they would find the escaped prisoners in like condition, were searching the slope below them. Duke raised Chanday's dart gun to his shoulder. Fuller struck aside the muzzle of the weapon. "No," he protested. "No unnecessary killing, Fenton. They're completely fooled, and we'll be well on our way before they know the truth." Grumbling, Luke drew back from the rim of the excavation. Up here the ground was fairly level, but there were many fissures and small craters which made the footing precarious. The mists were so dense they could see scarcely 200 feet ahead. "We'll be lost in the vapors when they finally wake up and come out after us," Fuller said. "And look, Fenton, off there to the left are the three columns of fire that mark the rendezvous." They plunged on through the red mist toward the flaming pillars. Those beacons, even though they subsided at regular intervals, quickly reappeared after each cessation, and their brilliance penetrated the mist with ease at this distance of about 2 miles. There was no fear of missing their destination. "Sure your friends'll be there?" Luke asked doubtfully. He was beginning to have some misgivings about the matter. The scientist had been anything but explicit as to who these friends were. And the longer his thoughts dwelled upon the things Fuller had told him, the more suspicious he became. Pretty cagey about everything but the actual getting away from the workshop, Fuller had been. "Certainly they will. They've been waiting 2 days." Fuller's tone was impatient, and his words came painfully. "You leave that part of it to me, Fenton," he gasped. There was a fleck of blood at his lips. As the scientist stumbled on through the mists, Luke's doubt increased and he began to lose his respect for the man's intellect and for the cunning which had enabled him to outwit the neutralizing energies used by the guards. After all, he was a weak and puny specimen. They all were, the smart guys who held the people of 2 worlds in their power by exercising the knowledge they had learned from books. And this one had failed even in that. Whatever he might have been, he had run afoul of the law himself and was already a doomed man. Tricks. This trick of Fuller's had gotten them away, but of what use was it without the brute force necessary to carry on to a successful end? The brawn Tom had spoken of so slightly was what they needed from this time on, and nothing else would save them. Luke had that brawn. Fuller did not. The scientist slipped and nearly lost his balance at the edge of a fissure, but Luke made no move to help him. It was every man for himself at this stage of the game. Increasing difficulty came with every step. Now they were sliding and rolling into a deep crater, now scrambling up its steep sides with hands torn and bodies bruised by the jagged boulders. A yawning crevice opened before them and they were forced to skirt its edge for fully half a mile in the wrong direction before they found a crossing. And the cold was unbelievably intense. Numbed and silent, their eyes half blinded and lungs seared by the frosty air, they struggled on toward the 3 pillars of flame. And still Tom Fuller carried on, though Luke was now in the lead. They had covered probably half the distance to the flaming columns when shouts arose behind them. The guards were on their trail. "Can't find us," Fuller panted. "The mists." "Hell, the mists are clearing," Luke snarled. "You ain't so damn smart as you think." What he said was true. Though there was less light on the account of the new angle with the sun farther below the horizon, the red mist was definitely lighter in color, noticeably less dense. Visibility was good to several hundred yards. Luke turned his head, but could see nothing of their pursuers. "They can't," Fuller insisted weakly. Luke pushed on with renewed vigor, ignoring him, cursing. And then there came faintly to his ears the twang of a dart gun, the shrill scream of its deadly vibrating missile, a violent blow that flung him headlong. Like a cat, he bounced to his feet, crouching with Chanday's dart gun at his shoulder. A strangely grotesque heap was at his feet. Tom Fuller. Off there in the thinning mist he saw a shadowy figure and he fired at it twice. Whether his darts found their mark he was never to know, for a wall of white swept down suddenly to obscure his vision. Snow! Great massed flakes falling endlessly. The moisture of the mist crystallized and closing in on him to hide him even more safely than had the mists themselves. He was on his knees then at Fuller's side. A brilliant flash and a screaming roar over amongst the rocks apprised him of the fact that the guard's dart had gone wide. And yet Fuller was down, moaning with pain. Luke tried to turn him over and found that his body had taken on tremendous weight. He was flattened, crushed to the rocky surface of Vulcan by the full force of its gravity. "What the devil?" he grunted as he heaved and strained. "What'd they do to you, old man?" With great effort he succeeded in turning the scientist's face up. Then he saw what had happened. He knew in a flash that Fuller had saved him from the singing dart whose energy was making a sizzling puddle of the stones where it had landed. The missile, in passing, had carried away the belt and part of the fabric of Tom's garment, carried away the capsule and the radium that energized it. Made the thing worse than useless. And Fuller had done this for him. He had flung himself upon Luke to shove him out of the line of fire, risking his own life gladly. Lucky the deadly dart had missed his body, but— "You go on, Fenton," the scientist was whispering through lips that were blue and stiff. "Leave me here. I'm licked. But you can carry on the work. Go to my friends and tell them everything. Tell them what you saw back there. Tell them—" "Shut up!" Luke's words were softly growled. There was a new and utterly unaccountable huskiness in his voice as he straddled the prone body and locked his strong fingers underneath. "You ain't going to be left behind," he grunted. "We're going on, brother, together." His back straightened and Fuller was swung clear off the ground. His huge biceps tensed and the scrawny scientist was up in the air, up and above the bowed head, then let down gently to rest across the broad shoulders of Luke Fenton. Fuller hung there, bent double by the immense weight of him, crushed to painful contact with the taut muscles that carried the strain. On Earth, Fuller might have tipped the scales at a scant 130 pounds. Now his sagging body was a load in excess of 700 weight. With that load upon him, and glorying in the effort it cost, Luke staggered on toward the triple red glow, which even in the blinding whiteness of the snowfall marked the location of the columns of fire. That all feeling had left his limbs in the deep biting cold meant nothing. That his lungs were near bursting under the terrific strain meant even less. Luke Fenton had found a man, one he would fight for, not against. And miraculously he had found himself. After that there was a blur of interminable torture. Reeling and stumbling, his leg and back muscles shot through with stabbing pain as the frost worked slowly upward. Luke prodded doggedly ahead. An occasional shout came from far behind where the guards still searched the rocky plateau. Across his great shoulders, Luke's burden was a dead weight, of corpse-like rigidity and stillness. Yet Luke clung to it tenaciously, disposing the drooping leaden limbs as comfortably as possible by the judicious spreading of his own brawny arms. Fuller, he was sure, had not long to live in any event. XC had already progressed to such a point that it was hardly possible he could recover. And yet, these smart guys like Luke always had detested, the doctors and surgeons and such, they might be able to do something for the poor devil. Anyway, he determined, he'd get the scientist to his friends dead or alive, and he'd see to it that they treated him right. If they didn't— The red glow was suddenly very bright, and a silvery metallic shape loomed up before him in the whiteness. An ether ship! Luke tried to call out, but his bellowing voice was gone. Only faint gurgling sounds came from his throat. He pushed forward with a savage summoning of his last ounce of energy, and Fuller's weight was that of a mastodon upon him. The curved hull of the vessel was overhead when he slipped and fell to one knee in the thick carpet of snow. Luke saw them then, a dozen strangers running from the open-air lock of the ship. In uniform, some of them, government officials of Earth and Mars. Damn them! It was a trap. Knowing vaguely that they had surrounded him, he let Fuller slip from his shoulders and lowered him gently to the snow. Lurching to his feet, he stood swaying above the scientist's body, ready to defend the helpless man against any who came to take him. Defiant curses died in his paralyzed throat as darkness swooped down to blot out all consciousness. His steel-sinewed body, beaten at last, slumped protectingly over the lanky form of his new-found friend. When Luke next saw the light, he stared long and hard at the immaculate white walls and ceiling that shut him in. A gentle purring was in his ears, and he knew he was in an ether ship that was under way. He lay weak and helpless beneath snowy covers, on an iron hospital bed. There were voices in the room, hushed, odd voices, and Luke moved his head painfully to stare across the room. Fuller, he saw, was stretched on another cot, pale and still. And a white-clad nurse was there, bending over him, talking softly to a doctor. The words that passed between them brought enlightenment to Luke, and more. They brought a new elation, and understanding, and hope. When the doctor and nurse had left, Luke lay for a long time with his thoughts. There was a man, Tom Fuller. Unafraid, as an agent of a special governmental committee investigating prison conditions, he had volunteered to get the evidence on Vulcan's workshop. And he had done it, even though it was almost certain that his own life was to be the price. He had dared the misery and hardship, dared XC and the horrible death it brought, that this hell-hole of Vulcan might be exposed, that it might be wiped out of existence by government agreement. Vulcan's workshop, where the gold dust of a certain political clique brought torture and disease and extinction to hapless prisoners who might otherwise be remade into useful members of society by the use of scientific methods, all this was to be no more. Fuller had succeeded where many others had failed. And Fuller was not to die. Only one of his lungs had been affected by XC, and this not too extensively to respond to treatment. Many months of careful attendance would be required, and many more months of convalescence. But Fuller, they were sure, would live. Luke gloated. From what he had heard, Luke gathered that there was to be no trouble about his own pardon. Oddly enough, this gave him no satisfaction. Something had happened to him, inside. For the first time he realized his debt to society and would have preferred that just sentence be carried out upon him. But not in that place, not in Vulcan's workshop. Luke shuddered. And lying there, he swore a mighty oath that the remainder of his life was to be devoted to entirely different pursuits. It was not too late to face about, not too late to learn. If Fuller would help him, he would learn. He had acquired a healthy respect for the book learning he formerly ridiculed, and he wanted some of it for himself, as much as he could get. His old creed was forgotten, and his bitterness vanished. Luke. At the scientist's husky whisper he turned his head. Fuller was gazing at him with wide, solemn eyes. "Thanks, Luke," the thin lips murmured. "Thanks yourself. Where'd we be right now if it wasn't for your radium?" There was silence as they regarded one another. "I need you, Luke," Fuller whispered then, "in my laboratory back home. I'll be laid up for a long time, you know, and there's much to be done. Your brawn and my brain will both profit. What do you say to that, Fenton? Will you do it?" Luke grinned. "Will I? Just watch me." Then, with a queer lump choking him, Luke looked away. He could think of no words to suit the occasion. He couldn't think at all, somehow. Blissfully he fell asleep. End of section 16.